Hey YouTube, I am back. I am sorry I've been kind of on hiatus the last couple of weeks, not intentionally, but I've had some health issues going on. I was diagnosed with POT syndrome, which is not that I'm on pot, it's postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And basically, what that means is that I have really weird blood pressure issues and blood sugar issues sometimes because I have really weird androgenic hormone responses. And so that's been a very interesting thing to get under control. And yeah, so that's been going on and it's just been kind of crazy. So today I'm going to talk about relapse cycles and relapse prevention. And the question was, are there stages to a relapse? And what I would say is that there are different stages in recovery, and relapse is part of recovery. I don't know that there are stages to a relapse, but there are stages in recovery, and relapse is part of that cycle. And the way that I conceptualize it is that actually I teach this as like a 6-stage model, and that people develop an eating disorder, and at the center of the model, when you first start recovering, for a lot of people, I know this is true for me and a lot of other people, the eating disorder becomes a core part of your identity or your sense of identity. And so part of the challenge of recovery is changing that sense of identity from eating disordered to what I would call the true self, or the real person inside you, and that takes a while to find. And in the process of finding that, you're going to go back and forth between different stages of recovery, because until you replace that identity, that eating disorder identity still feels like it's a part of you, and that takes time. So the way that I look at it is that you can't totally replace the old coping mechanisms until you have new coping mechanisms and have had enough practice and time integrating them, and have had enough experience in life where you have learned to identify yourself as something outside of the eating disorder, or something that's a higher purpose or different and productive. But that is a process and takes quite a bit of time to really truly integrate that, and a lot of times involves a lot of grieving in that, and losing that eating disordered identity, which is an important and normal part of recovery. So when a person moves towards, when a person's in an eating disorder and not ready to recover, then that's what I call stage 2, or protection of the eating disorder. And that's kind of like an area that can last, several months to several years, and depending on the disorder, depending on how the person looks, because unfortunately we have this stigma that you have to look like you're anorexic to have a real eating disorder, which is totally not true, because we know that a very few percentage of the population who have eating disorders qualify for anorexia, and most people are normal weight or even above what would be considered normal weight. And eating disorders are serious in any form, and so just because you don't meet the criteria for anorexia, it's not a reason to stay in a protected stage where you feel like your eating disorder is not bad enough yet. So that's where the eating disorder becomes really kind of entrenched as part of the core identity. And then things start to get bad enough that so to speak, the scales tip towards, you're getting a benefit from your eating disorder, but eventually the problems it causes start to catch up. So then you're like in this, okay, maybe I might recover. And then you maybe get into some therapy, and you start working on things, and you get maybe even excited about the possibility of change. And then you realize what I call stage 5 is that, there's challenges in recovery, and this is not as easy as I thought. And then a person may cycle through any one of those stages as they're trying to recover, even back to the protection stage at some points. And so that's kind of what I call the recovery cycle, and that happens over and over again until eventually you have enough coping skills and enough sense of a different kind of identity that you start to lose the need for that eating disorder to be part of your identity, and it's a slow process. It's very slow distancing, and so you'll go through that several times, most likely, before you get to a stage where you're not relapsing anymore. And usually what will happen is that in the beginning you're having lots of relapses, or you're not even really changing that many behaviors yet, but eventually you start to change the behaviors, in the time between relapse and when you're not using your eating disorder behaviors gets bigger and bigger and bigger, until eventually you start to lose the need for those behaviors. Now the catch is that a lot of times as you get more distanced, there are going to be times where you're triggered. And when you're triggered, those are the danger times, because what happens is we start to build confidence. And we build confidence, and sometimes we get overconfident. And then those triggers or that eating disorder can kind of take us by surprise. And suddenly we find ourselves right back into that cycle. And so when that happens, then you have a choice to make. And choice number one is to say, okay, I'm a failure, I screwed up, I might as well have an eating disorder. And then you get back into that cycle again, and then you have to work through it again. Or you can say, okay, I had a slip up. I need to figure out what caused this, and I need to fix this. And so the more you practice this, the more awareness you get of what your triggers are, what your danger zones are, and eventually you start to catch these before you turn to the behavior, or if you do, it's shorter lived, until eventually it starts to get more and more distance. And I believe at the point that I'm at recovery, it really, I've kind of moved on to dealing with issues behind the eating disorder that were driving the eating disorder in the first place, that I was covering up, which are difficult. But the more that I deal with those issues, the less need I have to have the eating disorder part of my identity. And I would say that the less attractive the eating disorder becomes. But that's taken a few years of solid treatment and recovery, and consistently working through things and not giving up, and not starting and stopping therapy. And therapy is a personal issue. Some people may not feel the need, but I needed to have consistent therapy to maintain a level of recovery and accountability and honesty. And honesty is one of the biggest issues. Can you be honest with yourself, be honest with your treatment team, so when you do have relapses, you can pull it together quickly and get back on track. And I think that's really the key. The key is the more you do that, and the more you can be honest with yourself and others, and you can say what's going on with others, you can be objective with yourself, then eventually you will get to a point where the eating disorder is no longer part of your identity, and you have a higher sense of identity, and it becomes less attractive, and you have a lot more energy. That energy that takes a ton of energy actually to maintain an eating disorder, you start to find, hey, I have all this energy to be productive, and I actually like my life, and I'm actually doing great things. And you find out, hey, recovery is better. And even though sometimes it's harder to deal with emotions and feelings and not to numb out, the overall result is that you get more comfortable with them. And the more comfortable you get with those emotions, then the less you panic with them. You learn that you can sit through them without dying, and that when you do sit through them, that they resolve themselves, instead of when you're numbing out with your eating disorder, then it just complicates it. And so it takes time and practice, and if you keep up with it, you will get there. But those are my thoughts on relapse prevention, relapse cycles, and I will talk to you next week.